Okay, I think we can get started here. So like I said, this is the Who Cares 2020 briefing. This is a national count of foster homes and families brought to you by the Imprint. My name is John Kelly. I'm the senior editor at the Imprint. We are a daily news publication dedicated to the rigorous in-depth journalism on families and the systems, particularly child welfare and juvenile justice. I am joined today by Melissa Carter, Executive Director of the Barton Child Law and Policy Center at Emory University. Hi, Melissa.
Hi.
And Andy Barclay, Statistician Extraordinaire at Fostering Court Improvement. Andy, thanks for being with us as well.
Hey, John, glad to be here.
So what we're going to talk about today, I'm going to walk everybody through the basics of the Who Cares project, what we try to do with this every year, the methodology we use, go through a couple of our key findings for the year, and then I really want to turn quickly to the conversation about our new measure that we're featuring, which is called family separation, and that these guys, Melissa and Andy, helped us put together and feature. It's really theirs, not ours. We're happy and proud to kind of include it in our project here. And then once we're done with all that, we will get to as many questions as we can handle through the chat. I just recommend that you put your question into the chat room, and me and our trusted producer, Talia, will mine that for questions. If anybody is shy about doing that or thinks of something afterwards, you can feel free to email me at jkelly@imprintnews.org. So the Who Cares project, we began it in 2017, kind of built it out a little bit in 2018 into a website. And what we're really trying to do is collect data directly from each state and combine that with specially obtained federal reports and data to shed light on, excuse me for moving my cursor there, a couple of critical questions here. How many children and youth are in foster care today? Who are they? And where and with whom are they living? And so to do that, what we do is first, each year conduct a survey with the states and ask them for answers that are kind of time marked to March 31st, so we can build a kind of a consistent basis to do this work, and ask them for the number of total licensed foster homes they have, how many of those foster homes are non-relatives. We ask them for how many relatives have an active ongoing placement of youth in their homes, and the number of congregate care providers that take placements of foster youth. We also ask them for a point in time count on March 31st of the number of children in foster care placements of any kind. We combine that with federal data, like I said, which is collected through the Adoption and Foster Care Analysis and Reporting System. And while AFCAR's data tends to kind of lag behind present day by sometimes more than a year, although I will say they've sped it up, it allows us to kind of provide numbers on the demographics of both foster parents and foster youth, and the trends in the number of youth living in different types of settings, which is stuff we're not able to get, as a journalism entity straight from these states. If you go to the website for this project, fostercarecapacity.org, you will be met with a quick explainer at the top, just about what the project is. The next section is a collection of 6 sort of featured data sets that we have here for everybody. We put the licensed foster home numbers and the non-relatives, the number of kids in care that we collect, the new family separation statistic that we'll talk about a little bit more, the percentage of foster youth living in congregate care, that's group homes and institutions, and the percent of foster youth living with relatives. So those are kind of 6 top line data sets that we feature on the site. What I think is really the best feature that we have, though, are the state profiles that we offer for really anybody interested in both a local look at these issues with foster care capacity, but also the ability to compare that local look to sort of national averages. These state profiles are just at the bottom of the homepage. You go in and you can see the numbers mostly set up in this kind of linear fashion. So you can see the year to year. If you prefer to kind of visualize it as a graph, you simply click that little plus sign on each one, and that will go from one to the next and turn it into a charted line for you. so you can kind of see trends. So let me get to a couple. I should say before I kind of talk through these, we have built this and the idea in mind is to just have this be a free public resource where anybody can go, to find out what they want for whatever reason they want to. But each year, we kind of just go through the numbers that we have collected and try and take a look to see, some things that have jumped out. So I'm going to go through a few of those before we start talking about, the new family separation statistic. For one thing, it does appear from our data collection to the states that the number of youth in foster care has continued to decline for a third straight year. Our 2020 count from the states is 418,917, which would represent a 4% decrease from a recent peak in 2017 of about 437,000 kids. I think it's interesting to point out that March 31st, which is again the sort of point in time that we base our survey on, was right as a lot of states began to take pretty drastic measures to protect kids and families and other actors, lawyers, and caseworkers involved in child welfare because of the coronavirus pandemic. So we really kind of inadvertently captured, a snapshot of the system right as things were getting pretty crazy in the United States. And I'll be very interested to see, whenever the AFCAR's federal data comes out, what this looked like even 5 or 6 months later, let alone a year later. And that's not something we have a complete picture of yet, but we'll soon. This slide here just kind of shows you the general arc for more years going backwards of the blended combination of the AFCAR's data from previous years and what we've collected in the last year. And what you see here is that the number of youth in foster care started to go up in 2012, peaked in 2017. We have been going back down for at least 2 years, and what we're projecting here is that is the case in 2020 as well. Another thing we pulled out of here, we've been able to collect total licensed foster home data from every state, with the exception of Delaware and Virginia in 2018 and Virginia alone in 2019 and 2020. Last year, we saw a fairly significant increase in the number of total licensed foster homes. And this year, basically all of that gain was lost. We went from 211,000 in 2018 up to 221,000 and change in 2019. That number ticked back down to 214,000 in 2020. And I actually think that in reality, the number is a little bit lower. Florida kind of changed the way that it licenses some relatives in a way that made them think that their change isn't really connected to any, substantial difference or change. Before I actually move on to that, I do want to say that, we're in kind of the third or fourth year of collecting different metrics under the Who Cares project. And I think as we get to 5 years, 7 all the way to 10 years, we'll really have a much better beat on the trend line, especially with the number of licensed foster homes. But it is a bit, I guess it jumps out to me, and Melissa and Andy, you can maybe weigh in here if you guys have thoughts on this, but that you really do see anecdotally around the country a lot of media coverage about the desperate need for foster homes in certain areas or in some states or in some counties. And this number is roughly half of the number, the number of foster homes is roughly half of the number of youth in foster care right now, given that they are not the only, placement option that child welfare systems have at their disposal. There is congregate care, there is the use of relatives. I guess it does jump out to me that early on here, what we've seen is that there's quite a lot of foster homes when you look at it in the aggregate, and yet you see lots of local systems really, at least in their own minds, struggling to get to the capacity that they want. Either one of you guys want to weigh in on that real quick before I move on?
Yeah, John, I think the research point is something around, ideally you'd have at least 2 placement options available for every child in care. And that's meant to reflect or allow for some flexibility in order to have a placement that best meets that individual child's needs. So I think we have this incongruency between the capacity and the drive towards capacity. And frankly, I think most of our systems don't feel the luxury of being more more particularized in our placements. We just sort of we know that we need placements, and so we spend a lot of time generating placement resources, when really what we really need to do is something that's closer to a best fit for the individualized needs of children. We need to be able to know what those individualized needs are. We need to have a diverse and broad set of placement resources that can be matched to those needs. So I think, to me, that's where the incongruency is. We drive up and really celebrate and need to the contributions of foster parents, but we really don't yet have that right fit between those foster home placements and the needs of the children.
Right. Next finding, I've titled this "Foster Care Gets Less White," and that is kind of antithetical to what you're seeing on the screen now. So give me the chance to move to the next slide afterwards. But when you look at the trend in the percentage of youth who, through the federal data, are identified as white, that number has gotten that portion has gotten quite larger in this decade. In 2010, 59% of youth in foster care were identified as white in AFCAR's data. 2019, that was 67%. What we noticed this year is that the difference in the change between 2018 and 19 suggests that it's kind of going the other way in quite a few states. In some of those states, the decrease in the percent of youth who are identified as white matched up with an increase in the number of kids for whom there was no racial or ethnic designation, but there were 12 states where we identified a decreased share of white youth, at the same time that the number of youth who are identified, or the share of youth who are identified to be Black, was increased. I should say at this point, don't worry if you feel at any point like I'm going too fast on these slides. Everybody who attends this, or even just registered to attend this, will get a copy of our presentation and a recording of the webinar. So you will have this stuff at your disposal, and you can feel free to ask me about any of it. Another thing that really jumped out this year is just how much things have changed in what I will call, high congregate care usage, or super usage of congregate care. If you look at 2010, all of these states that we list here had more than 20% of the youth in foster care living in group homes or institutions. And by 2019, that number was just down to 2. There's only Colorado and New Hampshire left among the states who have more than a fifth of their children, per the federal data, living in congregate care settings. So there's many more findings that we shared in our executive summary, and that is actually something that we'll also include as an attachment when we email out the webinar and our slides and all that stuff. But I want to turn now to the discussion about our kind of new featured statistic in this project, and that is family separation. So just to go over kind of like where this got started for us at the Imprint, the first year we turned Who Cares into a website, we got an op-ed from Andy and Melissa called "We Want Kids to Grow Up in Safe Families, so let's measure that." And I just think that this is a really succinct quote that gets to kind of the heart of it. What if we instead made our metric, our child protection bottom line, if you will, maximizing the time that all kids spend safely in a family, birth relative, kin, or adoptive? And so, since then we've been discussing, how could we work on adding that into the mix of things that we show people on this site? And this is the first year that we're doing it. So what is family separation? I'm going to have Andy kind of go through that in a second. Just the basic definition is the average number of days per year that any child spends living outside of family. And that is based on all the children in a state, and the family included are parents, relatives, kin, or adoptive families. So I'm gonna move to this next slide so you can see the family separation stat, which is also at fostercarecapacity.org. And Andy, why don't you start by just kind of explaining, how how you built this metric, why you chose this, and kind of talk people through a little bit of that.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, so I guess the main motivation here was that in all those other stats that we were citing on your site,
Mhm.
they're cross-sectional, meaning that we take a slice of the year, which is actually just 2 days on AFCARS. It's September 30th and March 31st, and we look at the kids in care on that day. And so obviously that's not a very complete picture. And it kind of, it's a complicated picture because it mixes in kids who are staying there for, in foster care for a couple of days with those who have been there for their entire lives. And so the missing variable here is time. And so my background is largely in public health biostatistics, and we have a measure that blends the two things, like the cross-sectional look, and blends it with the time. So you take, for instance, in public health, we have exposures to something like, say, an incinerator, say, a toxic source. It matters just not just how many people are exposed to that toxicity, but for how long, the duration. And you know, likening it here to foster care, not saying that it's toxic, but it doesn't matter whether it's a plus or a minus. The length of exposure matters a lot. So that's what this is capturing. Is so what I'm doing is I'm taking the AFCARS data, and it breaks down by placement types, and it tells me when each placement starts. Um, Now it misses some of the placements because it is this snapshot in time on either end, but from complete data, I can see that it's missing about 30% of the placement changes. So minus that, or to that level, I can see what placements children were in and for how long during the year. So, so the idea was that we would look at the placements where children were not with the family that they're going to eventually be permanent with, that they're going to end up with. And the closest we can come to that is to add up all of the days that all the children in foster care spend with either in a trial home visit, which means they're with their caretaker from whom they were removed, with a relative placement, or with an adoptive family in a pre-adoptive type home. So, and they get categorized as such as soon as the adoption is it's not, as soon as they agree to the adoption. So now that makes it a little difficult, right? So those are all placements in foster care where the children are with family, but it's a lot easier to tell when children are outside of the family. So we're flipping it around to measure what the system does in terms of how much separation from the family the system causes. And this is in terms of total days. So the numbers you see here are average numbers of total days that children in each of these states spent in either group homes, institutions, non-relative foster care largely. The others are runaways, and there's some other minor categories. So so it's mostly adding up the days that children spend with non-relatives, largely in either non-relative foster care or in group homes, and then just simply dividing that number of days by the number of children in the state. And that gets you the average number of days that each child in the state, if they all spent time in foster care, would spend separated from their family.
Right.
So a higher number on this measure means more family separation. So you really want what we're looking for, and I think this is kind of an unalleeled good thing, is we're looking for something that's lower. And that's almost necessarily better here.
Right, that's a good point. So I'm going to come back to you to talk a little bit about what we're seeing on this chart, and what jumps out to you, and then we can get into some more, like, dig into the demographics and stuff. But first, Melissa, give the elevator pitch for why you and Andy and some others feel like this is a real North Star, that we should be treating this metric and what it captures as a bottom line, as you guys put it in the op-ed.
Yeah, so I think I'd start with just making explicit the assumption that underlies the title to our op-ed, and really that energizes this measure, which is we're assuming that it's uncontroverted, that's inarguable, that the central premise, our goal in child welfare, is to make sure that children are living safe in permanent families. I think that that's the kind of cohesive statement about all of these outcome areas of safety and permanency and well-being to a large extent. And so if we accept that, then this family separation measure is really the closest thing we have to a measure of family integrity. And we mean sort of the distinctions that are part of that, which is when we think about family integrity, we're thinking about things like the meaning that children give to these relationships and these families, the connection, the connectedness among those family members, and the continuity. And that's the kind of quality dimension, right? The experience of permanency being a construct that's both, about legal permanency and relational permanency. This is really getting at some of that experiential, the quality of permanency. And I think we don't get that from our point in time measures that really are just about where is a child placed. That those point in time measures that we've been using are really overly simplistic, and that they don't really reflect this more dimensional experiential quality of placement and permanency. And I think it kind of came together in a couple of different ways to us. I think there's a certain moment of recognition that we all had when we have, in our current times, the separation of children from their families at the border. And I think that allowed the conversations I was a part of, and I think for a lot of us, we became much more conscious of the fact that is what we're doing every day in our child welfare and our foster care system. And the reason that resonates so strongly and agitates us so strongly as a community is because that really is a violation of family integrity. And then as a policy and as a policy person and a lawyer, I get excited about this idea of family integrity being an evolving construct in our laws, that, where we started with the constitutional protections of the family were, sort of defined by the parent-child relationship, that a parent owed certain responsibilities and obligations to a child, and that relationship was protected. And what we're seeing increasingly as we understand more about child development and trauma and these family system dynamics, is even our law really starting to talk in terms not just of a parent-child relationship, but about family integrity, which again has this kind of reciprocal quality of meaning and connectedness, and allows for us to understand differently the parent's rights to a child, but also the child's right to family. And so I think for me, this measure, again, just kind of brings all that together. It's this experiential thing that we all know as members of families. It also reflects what we think our ambition is in child welfare, and really then respects this kind of expanding concept of the law and this evolving construct of what those liberties are in our law, taking us to this place of family integrity.
Right.
It's probably not an elevator speech. That's a little too long for an elevator speech.
That was a long elevator ride. It's okay. So, Andy, she just mentioned family separation and the sort of connotation that has in today's context, which is certainly what happened at the border with separation there. It kind of makes me think, like, what are there elements that you might like to add as a statistician to this over time to kind of more encapsulate other separation that happens that's not in there right now?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So we were thinking in those terms too. So I want to emphasize again, because I'm seeing some questions in the chat, that this is not a point in time picture. What you're looking at is for federal fiscal year 2019, the total number of days that children spent during the year separated from their family in foster care. Now, what we would like to add to that are other interventions, particularly state interventions, where we're separating children from families, as at the border, as we do with incarcerated youth. You know, there might be others that I haven't thought of.
Yeah.
So if we can get the tracking systems in place and get states reporting those sorts of things, we can add them together here. So
yeah,
what we're looking for here is that, you know, if we were truly, if we were prioritizing family integrity as our number one concern, and looking at foster care and these other interventions as a safety intervention, we would be driving this number to zero. We would have zero family separation, because we could keep families integral. We could keep them together all the time.
Yeah, you got my mind cranking now, like thinking about how you could kind of work towards having an aggregate family separation stat that you could then break down by, okay, what portion is child welfare related or juvenile justice related, or, you know, I think people in the mental health community would be interested in what time.
Right, and you could have if you spent days, say, in one setting that was perhaps you know, more toxic than another or something, or shorter stays, for instance. Shorter stays might create more attachment disorders. You know, we could count those differently. There's all kinds of different ways you could count these things.
Very cool. So let's talk a little bit, just before we get into some more in-depth charts here. What are people seeing here? Obviously, as you kind of laid out, this is an average number of days they spent that a kid is spending without their family. So when you see Utah 0.5, that is saying that the average kid or a child spends on an average half day outside of their family, all the way to the end with West Virginia spending, you know, an average of almost 5 days of the year outside of families. That is basically correct, right?
Yeah. So without the rounding, even my takeaway from this is, the kids in West Virginia spend 10 times as many days separated from their families. Are they getting better safety than Utah? No, it doesn't appear so. Maryland too. You know, so I think that's our trade-off right there. You know, and what's driving it, those are all the questions that I'd like to generate from this. But, you know, for now, I'm just looking at, okay, what are the relative ranks of these states? Very different practice.
Yeah. I was going to ask, were you kind of, when you put this together for the first time and really kind of were able to visualize a year of this, were you surprised by the range or not, or what? You know,
I was somewhat, I guess I wasn't that surprised by the range. I was surprised by some of the states, actually, where I didn't think of West Virginia as using that much congregate care. They do. You know, I didn't think of necessarily Louisiana as a place that had rapid permanence, but what they have is a very low removal rate in Louisiana. You know, Judge Gray in New Orleans has nearly eliminated foster care, and this is kind of what we're after here, is preserving the family integrity by children spending as few days as possible outside of a family. So yeah, I was surprised at the placement of some of these states. The range, no, not so much. I see 10 to 1 things all the time, 20 to 1 sometimes.
Now, Andy's a stat guy. Melissa, as a lawyer and an advocate, well, you're both advocates, but I mean, you know, how did you feel kind of the first times you digested this? Did you need to kind of convince yourself of what you were seeing, or what?
I mean, maybe sympathetically with some of the people watching, I think I'm still digesting it. I think, you know, this is more complex. This is a more sophisticated measure. I was pretty comfortable before, maybe just accepted at sort of face value, the measures that we have in place, like the number of children discharged to relatives or placement with relatives, and thought of those as appropriate measures. Not really, I didn't question the appropriateness of those measures in terms of our commitment to things like using relatives, or you could do the same thing when we think about all the permanency dispositions, to think about those being reflections of a moment to reunite with family, or to finalize a permanency with family. So all that is to say, I'm still digesting it. I think but I do get really excited about this as in the way that we've talked about it, as a reflection more of family integrity, because keep in mind here, what we're talking about are permanent families, other than being permanent and non-permanent, we're kind of agnostic as to which kind of family we're talking about. And so I think it really does embrace, these kind of more non-conventional or modern forms of family. It allows for all of those constructs, instead of sticking us with a nuclear kind of family ideal that so often our laws and policies track. I think that works really well for this system. I think it also reflects some other things, right? This is a reflection of where we get to when we think about the numerous mandates of various kinds that speak to drivers towards family. This gives us a better sense of where we're landing with all of that. And then I think lastly, because you were talking about the differences across state, I think we're always concerned. I know I share this with probably everyone engaged in this conversation, always concerned about differences in geography. Like, is there a different justice that comes, if we think about family to integrity as some principle of justice for children and families, is there something that's differentiated by geography, and is that appropriate? I think this helps us reflect on all those things and ask all those questions.
Oh, wait,
Yeah.
John, before you go on to that, I was thinking, because we don't have a slide on this, I just wanted to mention that we've not seen a lot of variation over time in this measure. So we got 10 years of good data up there, and nationally, not much of a change, right?
Yeah, didn't it go from 1 to 1.1?
Went from 1 to 1.1. And then the other thing I want to address, something in the comments too, is about these numbers being so small. It's this was something we struggled with too, because I know these look like really small numbers, don't they? Like really, we're talking about 5 days, not that big a deal. Yeah, but no, that's 5 days for every kid in West Virginia. Think of it that way. That's a lot of days. When you add them up. So it's kind of, those days come out of a very small population, a subset of the population, the ones that go into foster care.
Right. So Melissa mentioned that, it brought up a good point there, that we do have, kind of point in time markers of family involvement. We try to add some to Who Cares, but you put together this spread for us, and it does jump out. There's really not much of a correlation between.
They don't really line up that well, do they?
Yeah. So talk about that. Tell walk people through that. Yeah,
and this is what bugged me was, we keep looking at this percentage of foster youth living with relatives. So, my anecdotal story for this, or the example I use, is Illinois, when they moved kids from being with relatives in foster care to being with relatives outside of foster care in guardianships. They did that practically overnight, and practically overnight, their percentage living with relatives went from like 60% down to near zero. And so what did that mean? Well, it meant nothing to the kids in those families. They were with the same relatives they'd been with for years. They were just on a different funding stream that they didn't know about. So it's problems like that with this percentage of youth living in, X, add your placement here. The denominator of that is all the kids that we have in foster care. And when we do have 10 or 20 to 1 variations in removal rates, and we do have 10 to 1 variations in not median times, but we have a lot of variation in the time that children spend in care. So you're using two things that are closely related. You're not really getting the picture of the population as a whole, and that's what this does. So putting this against what we would expect to track would be, okay, so we're using relatives a lot more in foster care. That should be helping a lot. Well, West Virginia's, one that they don't use relatives that much, but I mean, they're not that far off the national level for usage of relatives, but they've got these incredible amounts of time that kids are spending in congregate care and in non-relative placements, and that's not captured in that. So the alignment here is, I mean, just look at the ones that are really off. Yeah, the West Virginia kind of tracks some, but Virginia does not, right? So Virginia has a very low. I think we have percentage of living with relative on top, and then the family separation on the bottom here. So Virginia has very few living with relatives in foster care, and they also have very low family separation, which means they're keeping kids in family a lot more, which is necessarily good. But if you just looked at the percentage with relatives, they don't look so good. But that's because they move them out quickly.
Well, that, and then also, and I don't think there's
a remove.
Yeah. But then also, I mean, is it the case, do you think? I mean, I know you are aware of the kind of ongoing discussion of shadow or hidden foster care, right? Where kids are moved, but they're not in foster care. Technically, they are moved. That's kind of hard to capture within here for that very reason, that it's hidden for a reason, that no one's counting it right. Right.
Well, yeah, and I'll defer to Melissa there again, because this is a legal construct we've got here. I mean, we have a legal intervention, which is foster care, which is an extreme thing, taking somebody's kids away. So those other placements, yeah, okay, there's a lot of pressure, perhaps, but those are not the same legally.
I think those raise questions, John. I think that, not to take us down a path on that discussion, but I think those raise questions, all kinds of questions, primarily about safety. And I think this is a little bit more on the side of permanency. If we were lining up these measures against these broad outcomes that we've all become so conversant in. And I think, for those, if anybody's sort of struggling to grasp this, I'll sort of speak from the place of my own understanding, which is what made sense to me. The light bulb that went on for me is this idea with these point in time measures, where we might set these targets because we know what the research tells us, because we have values for placing children with relatives. We then set these targets about how many children should be placed with relatives, and we hold states up and we compare states in terms of their, how well they do that. But those are really incomplete, if not distorted, views of what we're trying to actually accomplish. They really don't have this kind of dimensional dynamic quality that we're talking about. You could remove more children and place them at really high rates with relatives and look really good as a state, but that doesn't account for the disruption in families, the trauma experienced by children, these other kinds of things that we, again, have a greater understanding about. And so therefore, at this point in time, we can and should embrace a more sophisticated measure that tells us something more about the appropriateness of the decisions that are being made.
Yeah. And I'm just going to move to the next slide because it actually just shows this the other way.
Yeah, so just flips it over.
It's sorted here by the percentage of foster youth living with relatives, but if you just flip it, you can see that,
So here we ranked it by the family separation measure, so you can see it both ways. But yeah, it's the same correlation either way, and that's a fairly low correlation, 24%.
Yeah. Yeah, Andy, I put this in here because I was kind of curious for your thoughts if you had them on this, and then we'll get into some other kind of juxtapositioning that we did with the data. But this is just a visualization of, if you teased out African-American family separation and white separation here, it looks, and I'm a layman, so please correct me if I'm wrong. It looks kind of like it tracks with it almost always being the case. That the African-American separation is much higher, right? Or am I wrong?
Yeah. I mean, that's why I like this. I mean, in some places like Mississippi, it's the same, right? But yeah, everywhere African-American separation is more days spent by African-American kids in outside of a family than white kids.
Yeah. And that's also, this comes through also. I'm going to move to two different demographic ones that we have here, but this is the kind of juxtaposing the American Indian RDI index number. This is all Andy's work, not mine. Against the family separation for that group, and this seems very correlated, right?
Right. Yeah, here we correlate because, we have super high removal rates and super high lengths of stay in American Indian communities. These things go together, right?
Yeah. And so when you look at the next one, and again, do not worry, you were going to be able to get these slides for yourself to look more closely at each number and all that. But here, same deal. It's an RDI. It's a racial disproportionate index against family separation for African Americans. So what do you conclude there? And we just lost Melissa. She was nice enough to join us, even though she's at a conference right now. But what do you make of the fact that this correlation is so low when the American Indian one is so high?
Yeah. Okay. So I think what I would make of this, well, I'm theorizing here. So would be the correlation is a little more right than we saw in some of the others, but so 34%. Yeah, it's somewhat correlated, but right, less so than the American Indian. I think because we're looking at shorter stays and we're looking at a lot more placements with relatives. So I know here in Georgia, I don't know that I've looked at this anywhere else. Well, I have looked at it with American Indian placements though. But we tend to find larger relative networks in some of our poor Black areas. And so we find it's easier to find placements. So we can keep children with family while they're in foster care more often. We can also avoid foster care more. So, it's the family separation metric is showing this is based on the time that children are spending separated, rather than just a racial disproportionality index that's using a point in time. So right. It's very different. If the removal rates are very different, and if the lengths of stay are very different, that's going to be different.
Yeah. Okay. Well, it looks like we got about 15 minutes till 5 o'clock on the East Coast here. So, Andy, if you're up for it, we'll just I'm going to pull up the chat and we can get into some questions here. Are you good with that?
Yeah, sure.
All right. I'm just going to start from the top of this thing and kind of move through it. So Lisa Real asks, first thing that immediately comes to mind here is how cooperative each state is when you are collecting data. Can you trust all of the state data? I guess that one's for me. But Andy, I'd love your feedback there. I can just say from our perspective that we present them with an immediate set of questions and work very hard to clarify anything that they that is confusing to them. I have found, I got to say, the vast majority of states to be very helpful in providing this to us. Some of the time, it's very clear that states have what we're asking at their fingertips, right? Like they know how many total licensed foster homes they have. They even can tell us, even though it's probably something they have to extract, how many relatives have an active ongoing placement. But in total transparency, I do think it's entirely possible that one state may interpret something a little differently than another. I do think that's probably the case sometimes. But I've had a pretty good working experience in just getting the information from these guys.
Yeah, I think that's pretty great, and I think you and I had some back and forths about the terminology that you use too, the way to ask the question, right?
Yeah.
Because it's super important, and having worked with most of the states, I think the terms are very different in different states too. So you got to ask the right question for the right state.
Yeah. Colette Byers asked how we define congregate care. I mean, the congregate care information that we've shared thus far has been through AFCAR's, and I know that AFCAR's definition is they basically break that down into group homes and institutions. Now I know that shelters are another form of congregate care. I believe that the instruction to states as far as AFCARs go, which seems suboptimal to me, is to decide for themselves, right? Like where to put that. I don't think.
Oh, I think shelters go in an institutional.
They do go institution,
yeah.
right? So it's folded in there.
Yeah, I know a shelter when I see an institutional setting and $0 per month.
Yeah,
that's a shelter.
So Andy, Andrea Widener, I hope I'm getting that right, from Maryland. I'm a little confused about this family separation number. I'm in Maryland and we are toward the bottom of all states in time to permanency. But this shows us almost at the lowest in family separation. How could those both be the case?
Oh, low removal rate. Yeah, would be, yeah. But did we get the question again? Is it?
Sure, yeah. So the question was,
long stays?
Toward the bottom of all states in time to permanency, but this shows us as lowest in family separation. She's wondering how those could both be true at the same time.
Okay, so I guess bottom means really longer times to permanency.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, I mean, certainly it depends what you're measuring, but if it's some of the federal measures like they use in the CFSR, yeah, that can totally line up because they measure things like percentage reunified within 12 months and 24 months and so forth. Different types of discharges, but what they're not capturing are the tails of that. So you'll have some very long stays. You'll have some very short stays too, and the whole mix gets put together when you just add up the number of days that all the kids spend. So it's so I guess the answer is, well, yes, they could be having long stays and very low removal rates. So you end up with fewer days in foster care across the population.
Got it. Okay. So Richard.
Wait. Let me just add one other thing too. Is if they're like in some states, I know there's a practice of removing and immediately placing with a relative. That child spent no time outside of family. There was no family separation there by our measure. So it could be those too.
Right. So that while this metric is sort of agnostic as to the circumstance with which they're in with relatives, time to permanency is kind of a judgment on the status, right?
Right. Yes. So this is not the days they spent to get to permanency. This is what I'm counting are the days that they spent separated from family. So in a group home institution or non-relative foster care. So if they don't make heavy utilization of those three placement types, they're going to be low on this measure.
Gotcha. Okay, so Richard Wexler asked kind of like a clarification on the who's being counted here. I don't know if you see this one Andy, if you're at 422.
Yeah, that's why I was trying to clarify that it's not a point in time. It's across the entire fiscal year.
I see. Okay.
So add up all the days. I hope that answers it. I'm not sure.
Okay. We'll get to him with an answer.
But it's all the kids in foster care, and it's just foster care too, because I know people are asking about that.
Susan Smith asks, do you see any connection between this measure and do you see any connection between this measure and likelihood to be sued? It seems almost like the best systems on this measure are under consent decree. By the way, I spent years at Casey looking for one measure that captured performance. I wasn't successful, but you have done it here. Okay, so she likes the measure. She's wondering if there is a connection between how you do on this ranking and your likelihood to get sued. West Virginia is the worst.
So Susan and I worked together for years, and and we did not set that one up either. I guess we in the past we've talked about it does seem to be inversely proportional to your likelihood to be sued, right? I think that's what she's saying.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's that this has been part of one of my criticisms of some of these class action suits is that they're not addressing this. I mean, fundamentally, the separation from family. Often with these suits, they lead to more removals and more time in foster care, and that's, you know, if especially if it's outside of the family, that's bad.
Yeah. Felicia, you asked, will we be able to send, will we be sent a link to be able to rewatch this at a later date? Absolutely. We're going to be sending all people who registered the video. You'll have the presentation. You'll also have our executive summary for Who Cares that gets into some of this stuff. Mana Salter asks, is it really just 4.8 days a year in West Virginia? As an example, that doesn't seem that much for an entire year, but you did cover this a little bit. That, you know, it's a state youth population level count, you know?
Yeah. And, you know, so the other way we thought of representing this was put it, you know, and I can do this, put it all relative to the US average. So, you know, West Virginia would be something like 500% of the US rate. But yeah, I get that. It's a small, it looks like a small number, right? And you know, I can't help that. That's the reality. Yeah.
Yeah.
But think of it as spread across the entire population. That seems like a lot.
Yeah. Right. It just takes some adjusting, I guess, to
it does.
get your head around anything small, I guess, in terms of a statistic.
Yeah, I hate that we have to use a decimal place. I hate that.
Yeah, do it per million or something, so it's bigger. But so I saw a lot of comments about Judge Ernestine Gray and what's going on. You mentioned her. I would commend, you know, I think Talia put it in the chat, a link to Vivek Sankaran, who's a columnist for us, wrote a column about her. But there was a Washington Post story that really explains kind of what she's been up to. And I mean, it really boils down to that she forces the system down there to show that they've made reasonable efforts to prevent foster care, right? I mean, that's sort of what she's been doing.
Yeah, that's what we're seeing. I mean, yeah, I've watched her hearings, and you know, to me, it just looks kind of normal. I mean, she's just, as others have said, she's just enforcing the law. I mean, she asks for reasonable efforts, and you need to prove it. Yeah. So, you know, Orleans Parish on this measure would be the lowest in the country.
We got a question. I'm not sure who it's from because Talia put it in front of me because I think I went by it too fast. But the race demographics in here, the question was, are they population-based rates?
So yes. So yeah, it's race specific. So the population denominator is as children of that race, and the numerator as well. There is a wrinkle to that John noticed. So I should point that out, is that AFCAR's it envisions multiple race children, and I do, you know, use the data that way. So a child that is both Black and white will be counted in both categories. The census data, it's a little more complicated. So it's a little harder to tease out the right denominator there for those.
Right. Dana, you're asked, will the chat be shared as well? Interesting. I usually go and grab the chat at the end. I can probably try and do that in a way where we can share it. We'll definitely do our damnedest to do that. Andy, there's a hypothetical kind of being discussed in the chat, and it's going to be hard for me to kind of synthesize it all into one thing. But I am curious for your thoughts on this. Like, would this metric treat a state that took away 10 kids for 200 days the same as taking 200 kids for 10 days? And if so, you know, is there a way that you could, is that something you might explore, like teasing out somehow? Or what are your thoughts on that equivocation? Equivocation is not the word I'm looking for, but you know what I mean?
No, I get the question. Yeah, I think that as as with safety, you know, I would like to incorporate that too, but I can't count how many days that the trauma of a removal, you know, adds up to. So so I think that's got to be a separate metric that you put together with this. So, but largely, you know, if you avoid removals, this is going to be lower. But yeah, there are scenarios like New Mexico, I know, does a lot of these really rapid removals and reunifications, where those are causing damage, no doubt. And this metric does not capture that. That's true. And it is true that if a child is removed from a birth parent and placed with a relative, there's a cost to that in terms, you know, of the child. And no, that's not captured in this either. So, you know, I'm just trying to I'm trying to measure one thing and kind of measure it in kind of an easy to interpret way. And I think this does it.
Yeah.
It's just how much foster care or how much out of home foster care are we using? Because we want to avoid that. Or out of family foster care, excuse me.
No, it's okay. I think we have one question, time for one more question, and we have one more question, so I'll end on this. Monique Mitchell asks, it's a long one, I'll read it out. I'm struggling with the definition of family integrity as existing when a child's removed from their original parents and placed into another family unit. Would that actually be viewed as family integrity from the perspective of the child? They're separated from their family. That in and of itself cannot be diminished by placing them in a new family unit, even if it is with relatives.
Yeah, I think, you know, Vivek, in your talk with him, he brings up, you know, the overutilization, as he sees it, and I see it too, of adoption versus a guardianship too. You know, so I think that there are less invasive ways to do all of this. So, you know, I think that those ought to, you know, there should be different grades of family integrity, right? So if we can keep a birth family together, that's the best we can do. But I mean, you know, if we can bring another family member in to and keep the relationship with the birth family, then haven't we done, you know, about as well as we can and preserve safety? So, you know, yeah, it's a tough thing to measure, and that's why I measure the inverse of it. But it's also going to be a tough thing to define in the law, and that's what we'd really like to do, because we don't have parents' rights defined, we don't have children's rights defined, and we don't have families' rights defined, and I just think we need to clarify that.
Absolutely. Well, this timed up perfectly. We are at the 5 o'clock hour, so on the East Coast, and I want to thank Andy for joining us and talking us through all of that stuff, and Melissa in absentia. She's off at a conference, like I said. Thank you for everybody that joined us today. One more time, we will be sending you a recording, the presentation, the executive summary, and if I can actually figure out how to do it, I will try and get the chat in there as well. Seems possible. And if anybody has any other lingering questions or comments, you can email me, John Kelly, at jkelly@imprintnews.org. So Andy, thanks again. And thank you guys all for attending.
Yeah, thank you, John. This was fun.
All right.
Thank you all.